Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Industrial Insights podcast. We have Ralph Asher from Data Driven Supply Chain back for round two. So we're excited to learn more about supply chain network design and optimization and modeling. And this is a topic that for anyone who's in my business that's really focused on tenants and users in corporate America that uses warehouses. I feel like it's increasingly part of the questions, and it's a solution for so much complexity. So I'm really appreciate you being here, Ralph, and taking time to be here for a second time with me.
Thank you, Justin. Really appreciate being on this on your podcast, and looking forward to the discussion.
And General Mills, Target, and the military, those are some of your backgrounds. And were you doing supply chain modeling for all of these groups?
Not in the military. So when I was in the Marines, I was what's called a communications officer, where I was essentially leading technical teams that where we planned and executed against like radio networks, computer networks, and things like that. I actually ended up in supply chain modeling kind of by accident. Went back to school for operations research, which is it's a kind of an applied mathematics degree. Moved to Minnesota for personal reasons. My wife grew up here. We wanted to settle down here, and just started talking around. And eventually, somebody recognized what operations research was, and they said, they were working in the supply chain modeling group at General Mills. And in a few months later, a position opened up. They encouraged me to apply, and that's kind of how I started. So I did supply chain modeling in General Mills, and then at Target, and then started my company a few years ago, Data Driven Supply Chain.
That's awesome. And for those who didn't listen to the last episode, I remember with General Mills, you were talking about some M&A activity and international work too. And then with Target, about kind of the infancy of the omnichannel transition for Target, and you getting to play a good role in that. Being some great experiences before launching your own firm, where now you can do consulting for groups who are looking for this kind of expertise and don't have it in-house and need someone to help them with it. But before that, Ralph, the ports. I figure that's what's in the papers today, and that's what involves the supply chain. So I figured, what'd you think of this mess?
Well, Halloween came early. It was a very scary few days for us. And this is something that, for those of you, tracking things like supply chain professors on LinkedIn and on the internet. I mean, this was being warned about for weeks. It was, of course, very concerning. And I think that while, they reached the tentative deal, and it was like a 61% pay rise to get the dock workers back to work, I believe, starting Monday. That's only going till January, right? So there's still quite a bit of daylight, particularly around the automation question. And so while this particular strike was short, it'll be roughly 6 days when it's over. It's still going to take weeks for the ports to clear those backlog of ships all the way up and down the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. And we still got to go back to the negotiation table. So we might be in the same situation here in a few months. Hopefully not, but it's a breath of fresh air, but it's not a reliable oxygen supply, I'd say, at this point. If you're a supply chain leader and you're thinking about your first mile strategy, now is a really good time to look at your network design and think, what are the things that we can do tactically now to future-proof your supply? Both technically now to prevent potential backups and delays in January if a broader deal isn't struck. But also after that, more broadly, how should you be thinking about your import strategy?
It could be truckers in Canada. It could be the West Coast ports. We haven't had truckers in Mexico up in arms yet, but maybe that's our far next adventure.
Or the rail strike, that almost happened, that got kind of prevented by the government. On intermodal can go snarled pretty quickly.
Do you know much about if automation is how that's factoring into, clearly people value their jobs, and that's a reasonable feeling, and then adapting and modernizing is also a absolute necessity. I think a few would refute. So have you heard much about if they're going to try and retrain the people and allow some of it, or it's over time, or kind of what that might look like?
Yeah. Again, I'm going just from what I've read, and it's not as in-depth, of course, as some people who are very much in the the ships and shipping business. But what I've read is essentially a demand for a total ban on further automation at the ports, which is, in my mind, both unreasonable and regressive.
Totally.
because when you look at the ranking of technological advancement of U.S. ports, I mean, we are nowhere near the global standard. And if our country is going to continue to remain competitive on the global stage, trade and logistics is one of the most important components of that. And if we are being hampered in the ability to get goods in and out of our ports due to contractual prevention of automation, that's not bringing us forward. And now I totally can understand wanting to preserve your own job. I think that that's a reasonable concern. And I just believe that there's ways to address that while still bringing
It's got to be a better
the
way
state,
than just
the
banning
state
it.
of our
Yeah.
transport forward. Yeah. I don't think that that's going to work out well. I think, if we think about if the farmers of America had banded together and prohibited John Deere from making tractors or McCormick from making tractors, sure, there'd be a lot more people in farming, but in aggregate, that's not the best situation for us.
Yeah. That's a good example. And I love that that challenge plays into executives and their supply chain and their planning and their optimization. And then since I talked with you last, I have a client that's on the West Coast that is in a kind of like a e-commerce business, and they've scaled dramatically, ultra successful, very profitable, and it gotten to the point where they're looking into warehouse automation and how to store the product more densely and how to like bring the inventory to the person rather than the person going to the inventory. And along with that has come a whole host of, while we're at it and looking at inventory, okay, let's also look at location and wages and transportation so that when we make a huge commitment on a big building for a long period of time, like we have made sure that we've looked at all of the variables to make sure that this was a good way to proceed that's consistent with our business plan. And so when they said all that, I was like, oh my God, Ralph, I need to call my lifeline. So that was a great example of like a client that like real estate is a part of the big picture, and then having them describe like all the things they're looking into. And what I found is they have a lot of quantitative expertise from the finance side, but not anywhere in any of this modeling. So for them to try and grasp at straws for that, like they know that there's a need to do their homework, but they don't know like, okay, how are we going to do this? So I feel like that's a great example of like why someone needs your help, and kind of there's a lot of variables. It's not just like interest rates and maturity dates. Like I feel like the more I look into it, the more it takes me a moment to sit, like take a step back and be like, okay, let's look at the big picture here.
Yeah, absolutely. And decisions like this, as I mentioned, they are major decisions with long-lasting ramifications. If you're doing particularly a long-term lease with a lot of automation in your building, you're looking at tremendous capex. You can't look at this through just one lens and make that decision. It needs to both be a team effort in terms of individuals bringing their expertise, but then also you need to have some quantitative modeling approaches to it, because there are things like they're related, right? So where you're located is related to ultimately the fulfillment costs to your customers. Where you're located is also related to your labor costs and related to warehousing cost per foot, and perhaps even the cost of installation of automation within your building. And looking at these all, you can kind of realize, hey, I got to take care of all of these. And it's really easy to be overwhelmed and really think like,
Yep.
well, if I do this, then it's going to impact this. And if I do this, it's going to impact this. How it's all going to work together.
Yeah.
But that's where supply chain modeling really shines. It's the ability to take the fact that you have all these separate but related decisions
Yep.
and understand their interaction effects, and then come up with an answer that is holistically best for your business, and kind of do it in a quantitative manner. Not to say these decisions are entirely quantitative. It is also very much a qualitative business, because supply chain is a people business, but the supply chain modeling can definitely play a major part in influencing the broader discussions around those decisions.
Yeah. So let's say we are talking with this client with you. What are the first, where do we begin?
Well, beginning is just understand your business. I mean, so what does your sales look like? What does it look like both top line? How does that change over time? Has your sales growth or been fueled by one product or product segment, or is it roughly equivalent across them? What does your sales look like geographically? Are
This is
you
all in
in
the demand category.
yeah. So first you got to look at the demand side. And so it's not only product growth, but also geographically. Are you over-indexed in one part of the country over the other? And then how does that growth projection look over time? Is it expected that growth in the Southeast will over-index over growth in the Southwest for various reasons, whether it be the type of products you're selling or just overall demographic trends? So that's on
Yep.
the demand side. Then look at what's your current network look like. Do you have fulfillment centers now, and where are they? How big are they? What's your satisfaction with your local providers? If you're doing a 3PL,
I'd like to
what's
hit you
your thoughts on
about
them?
3PLs later on if we could go, yeah, and
Yeah,
its own,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. And so there's the first step is understanding the layout of the business. And then you can get in more of the quantitative things like what cities are you even considering for fulfillment centers? May I propose some others for you to put into a model? Are there some places that you absolutely do not want to go due to assessment of the labor situation or crime or whatever? Like there's a
Yep.
lot of these qualitative factors which then go into a model. We would build that, make some scenarios, some alternatives, get feedbacks, and then kind of do an iterative back and forth on building scenarios until ultimately get down to maybe like two or three potential options, and we'd recommend one. That's generally how we would do this kind of project.
And transportation, I got to imagine that's a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of those data inputs that we would need is, what is your current last mile contracts? Do you have an existing contract with FedEx, UPS, USPS, maybe DHL? Are you working off just the spot rates? What is the fulfillment time to service commitment do you have with your customers? Are you guaranteeing 2-day delivery or are you guaranteeing 5-day delivery? The faster your commitment, the more fulfillment centers you're going to have, or the more you're going to be paying for that higher level of service from your carriers. So we would all get that, and that would of course be interacting with your transportation teams and perhaps even transportation finance at that point.
Yeah. I imagine a lot of people start to think to themselves, where am I going to get all this information? Or I'm only privy to X and not Y and Z. So you find that in general, the majority of what you need already exists. It's just a matter of finding it and formatting it.
Usually it exists somewhere in the company, but as you alluded to, unless you're doing a supply chain design project, you are rarely in a position where you need to get all these different things because,
I'm just doing operations. I'm just
yeah,
doing shipping. I'm just doing, yeah.
exactly. If you're in charge of warehousing, looking at the e-commerce rate cards is not part of your job, right? And it's not something that you're going to be dealing with on a routine basis. So usually when we work with clients, we ask that we have an executive sponsor. And we'll say, hey, for example, in a statement of work, these are the types of data that we will need, and we understand that it will take some time to collect it, and there's probably going to be a lot of people across the company that will need to be on this project team so that we can
Yep.
get this. I
Yep.
have never done a project either in corporate jobs or consulting where we list all this data and they just say, okay, here's the database, here's all the tables you need,
Here you go.
and be done. It just doesn't happen, right? And so it does involve more of a team effort and a holistic understanding of getting this data across the company. Sometimes there's data gaps where you can either fill them in through assumptions or data analysis or buying the data from third parties, but that's usually a pretty small part of it. Most of it's inside the company, just you got to find where.
Yeah. It was funny is this company I'm working with was looking at alternatives. They're open to almost anything. They're like if there's out of state has incentives or a better like wage rate or like just like a combination of different factors that make it worthy. Like that's on the table now too. And we look at this state. If you have any suggestions, we're all ears. And it was liberating and terrifying at the same time because I was like, it's a big the whole world's a big place. Like I get that like your customer data should really like limit it down really fast, but it is interesting to like have companies be open to your suggestions too if you already have like a better ideas in mind or like a paths well-worn paths that are obvious choices.
Yeah, absolutely. And glad you mentioned about things like rebates or tax incentives because that can definitely shift where you should be looking at because it's not necessarily that the closest place is going to be best from your financial perspective if you can get a better labor rate or significant tax credits or things like that in one location over another.
Being resourceful, I'm coming up with the incentives people, and thankfully, as much as there's a cottage industry around modeling, there is around incentives. So we are helping like a quarterback that and like bring those resources to the table too. So you can model and you can factor in if you get tax savings on the property savings, equipment purchase savings, any of that stuff.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can say warehouse in this city is X dollars per square feet, and in this it's also X dollars, but we get a discount, and that discount can either be kind of a flat rate or hey, you need to spend so much to get that rebate. Like whatever, however the tax incentives are structured, usually you can include that into a model.
Yeah. I feel like the 3PL conversation is never ending. of like, do we insource, do we outsource now, in the future, for how long, for a certain initiative? How do you deal with that when you think through client engagements? Do you get a lot of that? Is that a common scenario for you to look at like, hey, gosh, should we, this building's really expensive, can we do it another way? Or what has your experience been with companies and 3PLs and how you can help them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of things like, do we recommend 3PLs? We don't do that. But we definitely do have clients where, I mean specific providers, but we do have clients that ask that very questions like, well, should we insource? Should we outsource? And usually they have a pretty good idea leaning one way or another. And I think there's good arguments for either. But again,
Yeah.
this is something that if that's even a question in your mind, you can include that as a modeling option. Now that's where say, hey, in Kansas City, we could do a 3PL, or we could do, we could build our own building and staff it ourselves. And that's where close partnership between the modeling team and a supply chain finance team is really important, and HR, of course, because I'm not going to be able to authoritatively say with an insourced model, this is going to be our headcount costs and annual burden. But supply chain finance, that's their bailiwick, and that's where they're going to be able to partner with us in that kind of input.
Yeah, I feel like that's a big one that's not going away. That like I could see that show up in a lot of people's models. And then if you're doing a model over a long period of time, like for forecasting, some of these agreements are only for 3 years, or like some of these leases are 3 to 5 years. So maybe you'd even have to model a couple different ways of getting in and getting out.
Yeah, absolutely. You can make network models quite complex in that they can be multi-year and that your decision around entering a building or exiting a building does not need to be the same across your entire horizon. You can put in things saying like, if I'm going to start in year one, I have to be there year two and year three, but year four and beyond, that's a choice, whether then to insource or outsource at that point. You can make these kinds of investment decisions and facility insource out decisions pretty nuanced in these models if that's the level of granularity that you want to base your decisions.
Okay. And then you see warehouse automation in your world at all? Of people thinking through like, gosh, if I do this, this will affect my inventory or my flows or my shipping, and having to play those out, or those are things people do internally most of the time?
Yeah, it's things they do internally. At least that's not one of our core competencies. I know there's a lot of great people like Mike Schulte who works in that space. Where automation comes up in our clients is always this discussion of should we be automating or not, because we have investigated it and we think that by automation we can increase our throughput this much. However, there's this investment, of course, involved in it. Whereas if we stay
Really
manual,
expensive.
yeah, and you can include that again as a modeling option. You can say this where, or if we're going to put a warehouse in Kansas City, or we're considering that, it can be manual and this is the cost structure, or it can be automated and this is the cost structure, but it includes this significant capex depreciated over 10 years.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's a big one. I see that I think a lot of people on our team are investing more time and resources and learning more about. Just knowing that, like, we see a lot of clients that are trying to factor it in, and the more knowledgeable we get about it, the better, and the more we can have resources that we can serve up. And then modeling. I'm learning the super basics in Supply Chain Guru, and just like modeling cash flows in Argus, like inevitably you blow your model up and you don't get the answers you're looking for, and then you're trying to troubleshoot and go back and where did I go wrong, and how do you deal with that? I mean, I got to imagine it's an iterative process, and you got to start simple would be my best guess.
yes, yes. So if you're doing supply chain models, whether it's in a commercial tool like Supply Chain Guru or Optologic, and there's a few other big players, or if like we do on our team, if you code it yourself in a programming language, debugging and what's called baselining, which is building a model that replicates the current state pretty closely, that is the longest component of the technical work by far. Because once you've gotten to the point where you have a model that more or less replicates the current state and you do a couple small changes and things don't look totally weird. Now you're in a really, really good spot. You're in like mile 24 of the marathon, and the Twin Cities Marathon is Sunday. It's the
Hey,
most
that's
important.
after the bonk. That's good.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
throwing
Yeah,
out energy.
yeah. You've already used up all of your mental energy. Now it's just time to run those scenarios.
Yeah.
So that is absolutely the biggest component of it. To your statement about starting simple, that's spot on. What I always encourage newer modelers to do is understand the end scale that we need to get to, but phase in what that model needs to look like from a development side. Do you need to have, let's say you have 1,000 SKUs for your company. Do you need to include all 1,000 SKUs right off the bat, or can you do it with one SKU? You can start with one SKU. Do you need to do every customer down to the 3-digit zip, or can you do it by region to get 4 customers? You can do 4 customers. That's not to say that the model results from that very simplified model is something you should be sharing with clients or even using to make internal decisions. But those models, when they're scaled down, they run a lot faster or they fail a lot faster. Either way, like you can get to a point where you can either gain confidence or debug. And that allows you to then say, well, if this works for little tiny model, I'm going to make it work for a little bit model and then work your way up. That is much easier to both troubleshoot and it also builds self-confidence much more than saying, I just built this gigantic thing and it failed and I have no idea where to start. Because I've done that when I was a first, and can be demoralizing at times. It's much better to start with something small and then build it
The
up.
excitement level is so high when you start, though.
Yeah, I know. It's like going in, you're hungry at a restaurant, you order 5 things, you realize you didn't need to order a 5,000 calorie meal. You could have probably started with something smaller.
No doubt. This time. How about AI, right? You gotta have, like, I've been hearing, thinking, talking, and I would think you would see more of it, like, flow through software, too. And your own code. Is that all coming together? Is that, I could see that should be able to help with troubleshooting if they're like, hey, it looks like this is going to error or this is outside of like a range that's reasonable. What's and where do you think we'll be going with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So based upon your follow-up, I'm going to assume that you're referring to like generative AI and large language models. I think there is potential for it. I've not personally used generative AI in like debugging, but I know that I've seen some individuals who have used things like ChatGPT to recommend the starting model. Like you might say as a prompt, provide a distribution optimization model with 5 DCs and 20 customers and three products, right?
Yeah.
And ChatGPT will kick out some code, and hopefully that's a good starting point. Right? So I do think that there's a potential for there in using large language models in supply chain modeling, particularly for kind of flattening the learning curve for people who are kind of new to the field. I don't think it's going to be the silver bullet because we all know ChatGPT is great at hallucinating and making up things, and if you don't have the critical eye or the experience to be looking and judging that code, you're going to go astray. But I think there's some potential there.
Yeah, that's no doubt it's not perfect and nowhere near, but there are places where it's got to be able to help out. And it seems like it's getting integrated into damn near everything. Like,
Oh, oh yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Just the ability to get the basics of a supply chain model or an optimization model in seconds, that can save many, many hours of coding and labor right off the bat.
Yeah. Uh, any trends? What are other trends you see? Just big picture of like you see people shift how they're thinking over time. Are there any trends that are you're seeing or that you think people will continue to factor in when they just are thinking through their decisions and having conversations with you?
Yeah, so the biggest trends that I'm seeing is around data and around interaction between national policy and geopolitics and supply chain. So I'll tackle those two, right? So my company's named Data Driven Supply Chain.
Yes.
Keeping track of the data side, keeping track of the supply chain side, and understanding how they interact with each other. Now, from the data and technology side, supply chains are becoming increasingly digitized. Even small companies are becoming
Thankfully, yes.
yeah. And so that means that your supply chain, even if you're a very small organization, your supply chain is generating a lot of data. Whether or not you're using it, whether or not it's accurate, whether or not it's being captured, those are separate questions, but it's generating a lot of data. And so I always like to talk about the use of data in supply chain in terms of what's called the descriptive analytics, predictive analytics, and prescriptive analytics. And when I'm giving talks, I show an image of a pyramid. So think of the base of a pyramid, wide, most important.
Yep.
That's descriptive analytics. How are you using the data that's coming out of your supply chain? And that includes things like telemetry data from your trucks, everything that's coming out of your WMS.
Internet of Things is probably,
yeah, Internet of Things, even things like customer reviews if you're a customer or consumer facing, or even a business to business organization. How are you using that data to understand what's going on in your supply chain? Because of course that's a big question sometimes. It's just what's going on and how do we understand
They
that?
said data-driven decision making in this meeting with this customer I brought up, and I was like, oh my gosh, Ralph named his firm the right name for sure.
Yeah, I'm many things, but imaginative with company names I'm not.
Yep.
So I decided to just go with that. Yeah, and so first step is, are we understanding what these data sources are? Are we capturing the right data? And then are we displaying it to the people that make decisions in a fashion that is both timely and easy for them to understand what they need to do. Because one of the worst things in the world with data is to just throw this gigantic spreadsheet or this extremely complicated dashboard in front of people, the decision makers, and say,
Yep.
here's your data. That doesn't help. If anything, that actually makes things worse.
Yeah.
And so then how do we predict and then make decisions on that? And I think that there's becoming the fact that computing power is so much cheaper now than it used to be, right? Cloud
Yep.
computing is a commodity, allows you to do things like,
We're building nuclear power plants for this stuff now. We can't do it for energy, but we'll do it for computers. Or maybe
yeah,
not building, but like,
yeah, Three Mile
yeah,
Island, right? Coming back
yeah.
online. And so that's really allowing organizations to make more timely and accurate predictions and decisions. And so I think that that's a great development. And part of that, the ability to make those decisions is the fact that open source programming is becoming much more common. So my team, we do almost all of our work in Python and R, two big open source programming languages. And it allows us to do things that when I started at General Mills 12 years ago, 11 years ago, we would have needed like 5 or 6 different commercial software packages to do the same thing. But now we can do it in one programming language. And that, what does that mean? It means that there's less time context switching. There's less time figuring out how to get data from one program to another. And it just makes everything a whole lot easier. And so from the data side, there's a lot of uh, beneficial confluence between just the awareness of data, the volume and velocity of data, and then the open source programming frameworks that make it more accessible to do those things. So have some trends on the supply chain side, but from there, what feedback would you have from there?
And prescriptive.
Yeah, prescriptive. Yeah, so just like getting a medication from your doctor, right? They prescribe what to do. It's not knowing what's going on in your supply chain and knowing what's going to happen is not as important, is not all that important if you can't make better decisions from that information. And so prescriptive analytics includes things like network design, but it also includes things like inventory optimization. How much should I be holding at each echelon of each SKU? And things like manufacturing optimization, things like how do I better sequence the products that I'm producing on a manufacturing line to get more throughput to out of the same line, or perhaps reduce my inventory levels without risking my service. So those are some of the big kind of prescriptive analytics, big decisions that you might be making. You can also make more tactical decisions with prescriptive analytics as well. Things like day-to-day recommendations on where should I be if I have 10 customer orders, what fulfillment center should they go to? And
Yep.
what should be the rules around that? And how should I be handling exceptions, dispatching of orders from like a manufacturer to the manufacturer's DCs across the country? A lot of tactical decisions can be made with prescriptive analytics as well.
Yeah. Are you getting more projects for people that are looking at manufacturing, kind of this onshoring, nearshoring, reshoring, friendshoring, and dealing with making more either in the U.S. or in Mexico and how that changes the equation for them?
Not so much. I think the biggest project that I'm seeing around similar questions is just understanding the overall impacts of those. So we're not going to, companies aren't coming to us and saying, hey, if I'm moving to Mexico, where should I be looking for a plant? Or, do you know people in that, a certain geography? Not what we do, but where we are in that a little bit is around can you model the cost structure, the inventory impacts and things like that. So
Yeah,
that's,
I got to imagine that's more and more. I've seen clients start to look at Mexico as they think through Southern California is very expensive. We're from the Midwest or the Southeast, and we had a presence out there. We have a presence, and we're trying to figure out what the future looks like if we're just going to be holding product and making it elsewhere. It is interesting to see them just to go through that internal calculus and then come out with their own solution. And it's hard to know like how rigorous the back end analysis is on it, other than just Mexico is a great idea at first. And then once you start peeling back the onion and you realize like it has its own variables and challenges and things that you have to get very knowledgeable about and like their own risks that you have to balance the trade-offs of. I haven't really seen too many that have then said, okay, yes, now we're going to do that. Most of them have just turned into kind of like the South. Like, let's move more to some of our sites that are in Louisiana or somewhere near there. And then, yeah, so that's been interesting to see manufacturing like in the States and what its evolution is going to be going forward.
yeah. And when you think about some of the impetus for nearshoring and friendshoring. Of course, it is to de-risk dependence upon Chinese manufacturing, but a lot of Chinese companies are setting up in Mexico. And so if you're thinking about the risks of nearshoring or the benefits of nearshoring, of course, there's a transit time benefit, right, and a inventory lead time benefit. But if you're looking surely from a geopolitical risk, you really should understand who's owning the companies that are making your products, even if they are in the Western Hemisphere.
Yep. Yeah. They may not be owned by who you think, or it may have
Yeah.
its own like upstream effects.
Yep. A whole lot of roads travel through China as far as supply chains go.
Yeah. Fantastic. That's a good start. I feel like otherwise, some of your experience from General Mills and from Target, I got to imagine a lot of that comes back to help you with your modeling for clients. So, what are some of the main experiences you had there that like you draw upon when you're helping clients?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things I like to say, and so I actually just gave a speech at the University of Minnesota, at a class a couple nights ago, and one of the questions I was asked was, based upon my experience, corporate world and consulting, what commonalities do you see across supply chains? Right. So very, very similar question what you asked.
Yep.
And what I reply is that, Tolstoy, the opening lines of Anna Karenina, is all families are all, sorry, all happy families are alike. All unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. Well, I have yet to see a happy supply chain, right?
Okay.
So every supply chain is unhappy in its own ways. Everybody has their own
Way to bring Tolstoy into
industries.
this. Yeah,
Yeah,
I like
yeah.
it.
I'm not much of a Russian literature guy, but I do know a couple lines. And so when you think about the commonalities between supply chains, it often comes down to the same core issues, right? It's distribution locations, manufacturing locations, mode selection, inventory levels, and how do we handle the trade-offs between cost, service, and inventory capacity? And then how do we appropriately segment customers and products? And so we don't take a one-size-fits-all approach to it. I think of my experience in General Mills, it was primarily distribution network modeling.
Yep.
And even within General Mills, they have three temperature channels. So if you buy breakfast cereals like Cheerios, it's ambient. It can be stored in pretty much any temperature of a
Yep.
DC. But then you have refrigerated and then you have frozen. So you basically have three different types of facilities, three different supply chains, all the way from raw material sourcing and finished goods or WIP sourcing to the ultimate delivery of
I
the
love you
products.
got to see it from start to finish, not just from like a
Yeah,
distribution center to customer.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, you can go to a plant and you can see all these stacks of cardboard, right, of cardboard boxes that they got from a vendor, all the way to seeing it on the shelf at a grocery store. And so that kind of end-to-end perspective really, really benefited me. Now, from Target, I think the biggest benefit is being able to see how a supply chain has to operate with a tremendous number of SKUs and a tremendous variety of buying patterns. The buying patterns of consumers of things like breakfast cereal at a Target is very different than the buying patterns of iPads or of, limited edition clothing collaborations that they have. And so your supply chain needs to address those types of SKUs and those types of buying consumer expectations differently. And that was not something that I saw working at a packaged foods manufacturer where demand was, more or less a lot more consistent over the course of a year.
So I would think that would make most people's problems seem easy. Then if you think of both of those two, like operating at such a scale and with so many SKUs, like most people's challenges are like far pale in comparison. Yeah. As a broker, I sometimes get the friction of bringing someone new and from the outside into the organization to not shake things up, but to like have an input and to take an unbiased look at what's going on and then like prescribe right solutions. Do you find that friction that you come across, or most of the time is it like this unhappy family where they're welcome to have a new therapist come and go through all their issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I would say that I'm very blessed in that the clients that my team and I are working with are, I mean, they're excellent partners, and they seek us out because we are a small team that will be focused on a specific problem that they need expertise and fast to help them with. So while I can definitely appreciate if that, what you described, if that happens, that's not been our experience. For the most part, we've had extremely great executive sponsors and project team members to help us move along because ultimately we're there to help them. That's the whole reason we exist is to help our clients.
Totally. Yeah. And you were telling me on our last one about one of your big wins where you got to see a new site that was opened as a result of your work, and that was gratifying and fulfilling because you're like, hey, I helped us figure out that this is what we need to do, and then you actually see like it was implemented, and there's new people being hired, and new like investments being made into that organization, into that area. So that's awesome. It's so good to see like the fruits of your labor.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why try to encourage people with kind of a data analytics background like I do to consider supply chain as a career because there's a lot of data type jobs that kind of ephemeral, like, oh, well, let's see if this ad is more effective than this ad. But, and that's kind of, you don't know if that's actually working. You don't know how necessarily know how much what you're doing is really impacting things. But when you go into a building and you see a lot of steel and a lot of concrete and a lot of product being moved and think, hey, I did something to either bring this about or to make this a little bit better.
Yeah.
That's really gratifying, I think. I found that to be it's very helpful.
Yeah, and that's not a short-term impact too. That's gonna like last for a long time.
Absolutely.
I was going to ask you about advice. Me having a nephew that I was telling you is going into industrial engineering in the University of Wisconsin, and advice for people that are like going through there and thinking through like a career they should study and mentor and internships and all that. But I think you already gave one of the pieces of advice there of like considering supply chain and like opening up that category as a place where there's a lot of future opportunity. Any other advice you would give for the college kids out there?
Yeah, well, first, if he's going to Wisconsin for industrial engineering, I think he made an excellent choice right off the bat. That's one of the top schools for industrial engineering in the country and a beautiful campus by far.
He's a
Yeah,
good guy and a smart cookie, no doubt.
good. Yeah, hopefully the Wisconsin. Is he from Southern California?
He is, so he'll become more pasty perhaps on his time there, but he did bring his golf clubs for
Okay.
3 months, maybe.
All right. I was gonna say because Wisconsin in the winter, just like Los Angeles. No need to worry about that. Um, yeah, I mean, just as a general advice to people who would be considering it. And this is advice I give to anybody in a data field is once you've decided what kind of business function you want to work in, so supply chain, for instance, you just dedicate yourself to becoming as knowledgeable as possible because you're not going to have the day-to-day experience of being an operations manager. But that doesn't mean you can't do everything you can to understand the nature of the supply chain, both of your company as well as broadly trends that are going on. And for that, then you not only become more effective in understanding how to apply those different types of analytics, but you're
Yep.
also better at anticipating problems. Like you could literally get to the point where you can go up to a business partner and say, hey, I know this trend's going on in warehousing. Is there something that you're dealing with or problems you're thinking about? And if so, what are some ways we can help? Maybe you can then propose some ways you could help right away. Just that anticipatory problem solving. And that really only comes if you have committed yourself to becoming very knowledgeable about that subject matter.
Yeah. And coding's not dead. It's not all AI coding now.
No,
Me trying to find resources to learn more about modeling was surprisingly difficult. And so, me going through a class at the University of Arkansas to walk you through that was super helpful. I'm in the middle of it now and really appreciate like the new perspective that it gives and access to super expensive software that like you don't, it's not like you can just go get that off the shelf anytime you want. And any other suggestions for people that are looking at like a modeling and just like a learning that better?
yeah, there's good classes again through universities like
We don't
Arkansas.
want
There's
every industrial real estate broker to learn
yeah,
this stuff, but like we could use a couple more, no doubt.
yeah. So I will do some shameless self-promotion. So I do have a Medium article that's talking about the basics of network modeling with a coding perspective, so not using the commercial software. So
Nice.
also my company we do offer training, and we do specialized training in this space. So if it's something that either company is interested in an overview of it or um, detailed training, or we do kind of overview training of different topics in supply chain analytics that is designed for data scientists and industrial engineers and people like that, or people who are just interested in that. So that aside, a lot of great websites out there, a lot of great courses, both free and of reasonable cost. It's just like Rodney Dangerfield and Back to School, right? Go ask your local college. Like the industrial engineering department. I think if you were to call them up and ask, what resources are out there, they'd there's somebody there that'd be happy to talk to you. Or
University of
those,
Wisconsin.
yeah,
Yeah.
or supply chain department. I teach at a class at local college, University of St. Thomas, and supply chain department there. That's where that resides. But
Yeah. This was great. This is like a different take on the same topic than our last interview. Is there anything I missed that you were thinking we might cover today, or that would be good for people to get a awareness of?
that's your question. Yeah, I would say that I was just at the CSMP Edge conference earlier this week in
You
Nashville.
were in
Yes.
Nashville?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. What'd you think? It seemed like it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it was great. It was a great conference, ton of people there, and I like to say that it has three of the most important things in my life. It had supply chain, of course. As a conference, it had a lot of free coffee, not necessarily good coffee, but free coffee, and that's the most important part.
Yes.
And country music playing everywhere, which is wonderful
Yes.
for me as a huge country music
I
fan.
thought you were gonna say beer and music. Yeah, we
Well,
were pretty close.
they did have a lot of whiskey there for tasting. Not my thing, but
Yep.
definitely a lot of country music. And one of the big things the two biggest takeaways I got out of it was, technology is being infused and data analytics is being infused everywhere in the supply chain.
Yep.
Everywhere from inventory management and trying to get a better cycle counts automation through things like procurement and tendering and all the way through things like network design. So like pretty much across the plan make source deliver model, score
And
model.
collaborating, yeah, on inventory with
Yeah,
suppliers.
yeah, and
Yeah.
S&OP, IBP. So pretty much everywhere across the supply chain, there's increasingly technology infused. Some of it they call AI. I'm not sure if that's really an appropriate label, but it's technology infused. And just being understanding of those trends is going to be tremendously beneficial. And you don't need to be deep in it all the time, but knowing that it's out there, and more importantly, how those things are meant to not supplant, but rather support and enhance the people that are running your supply chain and understand where those come together. I think that's really, really important.
Just like automation at the ports, Ralph. It's
Yep.
same but different.
Circle of life right
Yeah,
there.
super. That's great. I really appreciate you spending time with me again today, and feel like people will get a new things that they learn out of today's conversation. And appreciate you as always.
All
And
right,
you might be getting a call from me in a company on the West Coast that has some issues we got to work through.
all right. Happy to help. Thank you, Justin.
Super. Thank you, Ralph. Have a good one.
You too.
Yep. Bye bye.